Let's have a sesh on break-even analysis. In this sesh, I want to look at the impact of revenues and costs changing, whether that's an increase or a decrease, and see what happens to break-even output and also the margin of safety. We're going to start with the scenario of revenues increasing. So if revenues were to increase, maybe the business perceives they have higher brand loyalty and therefore they're going to try and increase their prices and they want to project, with the revenues now increasing, what would happen to their break-even output. So with their break-even chart, it would always look like so. So you're going to have units this way, cost and revenue on the y-axis, and then total revenue going through the origin and total costs slightly off of that. The reason why there's the gap there because of fixed costs, because they do not vary with output, with units. I've put two total revenue curves here, TR1, the original, and TR2, what happens when those prices increase. And you can see that the impact of revenues increasing is that effectively the total revenue curve will pivot slightly to the left. It gets steeper, basically. And if it gets steeper, this means that the break-even output is going to be less, which is a good thing. And you can see here that the break-even output is where total costs intersects with total revenue. So originally it intersected there. So you had a break-even output at this point here where my finger is, but it has shifted in when the new break-even output is calculated from the new TR2, the red line, and where that intersects with total costs. So the impact of revenues increasing on break-even output is that break-even output decreases, which is a good thing for a business. Obviously, the opposite will happen to the margin of safety. So the opposite of decreases is increases. So the margin of safety will increase if revenues increase. The opposite way around is that revenues will decrease. Maybe the business has more rivals. They have more rivals, so they're considering reducing their prices. Reducing their prices likely leading to a revenue decrease, and they want to see what would happen if they did some break-even analysis. Well, the same here. We've got total revenue, total costs. The blacks are the original lines, and the red is what the impact would be of the revenue decrease. And we can see that instead of, in this scenario, where total revenue pivots to the left, it gets steeper when revenues increase. The other way around is that it will pivot to, the total revenue curve will pivot to the right because it will get more shallow as revenues decrease. And the impact of that is that the intersection between total revenue and total costs will be pushed further to the right, which will mean it's a bad thing for a business because it means that it will take more units, for the break-even output to be established. And so clearly, if revenues are decreased, the break-even output will increase. And the opposite will happen to the margin of safety, and that will mean that the margin of safety is likely to decrease. Now we'll go through this for costs. So if costs increase, it's going to be because either fixed costs have increased or variable costs have increased. The way that the impact will be shown on the break-even analysis is slightly different depending on if it's the fixed costs that have changed or the variable costs that have changed. The reason why is because fixed costs do not vary with output, and that's why they have effectively a horizontal line that way, whether variable costs are a gradient, a line at a gradient, because they're based on the costs themselves and the units that have been produced. So we'll go in this case if the fixed costs have increased. So if fixed costs change in any way, in this case they've increased, then you're actually just going to get a shift, a parallel shift upwards in this case, because costs have increased, upwards in total costs. Remember, total cost is just fixed costs plus variable costs. So if we look here, we've got total revenue this way, and we've got the other black line of total costs. They originally intersected here, but then we can see that you've had the shift upwards in total costs, the red line, TC1, that's because fixed costs have increased, parallel shift, and that means that the break-even output point has shifted to the right. Because costs have increased, that's a bad thing. That means that the break-even output is going to increase. It's going to mean more units are needed to break even, and that means that the margin of safety is likely to have decreased. Now, the last scenario is that if costs were to decrease. If costs were to decrease, it's clearly either going to be because fixed costs have decreased or variable costs have decreased. Now, if it's fixed cost, it's always going to be a parallel shift, as we saw here. If it's variable costs, then it's actually going to be about that gradient, like in the revenue example that we were looking at earlier. So we're going to say that variable costs have decreased. And what that means is that taking these black lines, these original lines of total revenue equals total costs, leaving the original break-even output point here. If we get a reduction in variable costs, it's going to make the total cost line slightly shallower because it's going to come off the same point on the y-axis, because this difference here, well, that is the fixed costs. The fixed costs haven't changed here. We're saying that the variable costs have reduced. So the variable costs reduce, it will mean that you're going to get a slight pivot downwards in the total cost line. And clearly, if it was the other way, you'd get the variable costs will have increased. You'll get a pivot to the left. It would make the total cost line steeper. Now, the key thing here is that we were looking at variable costs. They are being reduced. What would happen to costs overall? Well, costs overall are going to decrease. And what that means here is that you're going to get your break-even output is going to come in because costs have gone down. That's a good thing. So break-even output will decrease. You can see it clearly in the chart. The opposite is going to happen to the margin of safety. That's going to increase. And I'll see you at the next sesh.